Good morning, dear friends. It's a pleasure to welcome you today to the public release of a document titled Protocols Complementary to the Second United Nations Charter. I see that we had a very nice online audience, so well over 100 people who are connecting from different corners of the world. Um, the release of this document um, is the next phase of a work program that began in 2023 when the Global Governance Forum convened a group of experts who essentially prepare a document, a paper that made the case that given the many risks that we face as a general condition in the world, that the time had come for us to rethink the UN Charter, the 1945 Charter, so that we could bring the United Nations into the 21st century. That document was released actually exactly 2 years ago during the General Assembly week. And it was accompanied by a one-page declaration. And I'd like to go back just for a minute or so to one of the paragraphs from that declaration, which I think is very pertinent, perhaps even more so a year later. That declaration said the world today is vastly different from that which gave birth to the UN Charter in 1945. The global governance structures enshrined in the Charter are ill-suited to today's reality. New institutions will be created, whether voluntarily through an act of collective will, or only after further catastrophes of untold suffering. Is the choice before us today. A UN Charter Review Conference is required to ensure that we make the prudent choice. That declaration was immediately endorsed by 20 Nobel laureates, and in the following days and weeks by a very large number of former prime ministers, heads of state, prominent individuals, uh, many associated with civil society organizations all over the world. Today, basically, what we're doing is we are launching the next phase of this work program. The UN Charter in 2024, 2 days before the Summit of the Future, we released the document called A Second United Nations Charter, Modernizing the UN for a New Generation. It was basically an attempt on the part of the experts that were convened to tell us what kind of a charter would we imagine if we took on this challenge of trying to modernize the UN system by going to the very beginning of its founding document. What kind of legacy updates, what kind of normative advances, what kind of structural changes, would we propose in order to modernize this very, very important? Now, today, we are basically launching the next phase of this work, which aims to fill in some of the unrealized promises of the 1945 Charter. Let me give you a couple of examples. Article 26 in the UN Charter calls for essentially a process of disarmament. Article 43 introduces the concept of collective security and essentially says that the Security Council should be given the instrumentality, the forces that will be necessary to make its decisions binding on its members. But those two promises were never realized. They are there. They have never been operationalized because we were overtaken by the Cold War soon after the adoption of the Charter. And then also in this document, which we're launching today, Protocols Complementary to the Second United Nations Charter, we are also developing or contributing to very important debates, which don't necessarily involve the need to revise the old 45 charter, but that nevertheless, can contribute some thinking, some ideas, and some proposals on areas that are tremendously important to their effective functioning of the UN system. And that, in a sense, is the subject of the first panel today. I think that you will agree with me that we live in a world in which we have growing needs. We have the needs to finance the transition to a green economy. We still have very high levels of poverty. For me, it is shocking as a former developing economist who worked many years at the World Bank to realize that we have more than 700 million people who suffer from malnourishment in the context of a global economy that is producing goods and services, at an all-time high. Yet, when we look at the United Nations budget, we see a rapid shrinking of the resources available to the organization. From 74 billion in 2022 to 67 billion in 2024. And the experts tell us that maybe this year it might come down to the levels that we last saw in 2015. So this is obviously, a great concern to people who are interested in the strengthening of the UN as an instrument for international cooperation. Now, we are in the middle of a debate under the headline of UN entity, and the conversation around this debate has very much focused on structures, on mandates, on management. And all these issues are, of course, very, very important, but they risk being cosmetic if the underlying financial model remains the main role, right? And so this is one of the things that we want to focus on today. The idea embedded in the first chapter of this document is that to fulfill the Charter's unkept promises of the past in collective security, disarmament, and development, it must first be important to secure, as we politicize, unpredictable financial ways. And so in this panel, what we're going to be focusing a little bit of attention on is what would the real fix of the financing model of the UN look like? So we will begin by showing you the first response from Ambassador Narvaez to a question which basically raised the following issue. To what extent is the UN financial crisis a technical problem, that has to do with budget structures and donor practices? And to what extent is it really a political problem of will and sovereign? Which of these two is it, or does it straddle somewhere in between? So if I could ask you to please show us Ambassador Narvaez's first response to this question. Thank you.
The current financial challenges facing the United Nations are the result of both technical and political factors. From a technical perspective, the organization's budgetary structure and rules make it highly sensitive to the timing of contributions and, most importantly, to their non-payment. Predictable and timely payments are indispensable. When member states delay their contributions until the end of the year, the organization's ability to execute its budget and deliver on its mandates is inevitably constrained. Liquidity tools have provided some short-term relief, but they have not addressed the deeper structural issues, which ultimately lie in the political dimension. Member states financing the UN through both assessed and voluntary contributions. Voluntary funding is a valuable expression of engagement, yet the growing reliance on earmarked resources is creating imbalances across mandates and limiting the organization's flexibility to allocate resources where they are most needed. As we well know from the latest report, around 80%, 85% of voluntary contributions have been earmarked in the past years. A shift toward more core and less restricted funding will help strengthen the UN's coherence and effectiveness. It should also be recognized that the main cause of the current liquidity constraints goes beyond collective behavior, but to a large extent from the delayed payment of assessed contributions by the organization's largest contributor. This situation is steadily moving the issue from one of liquidity management to one of sustainability. While there are still some technical adjustments that can help without more predictable payment patterns and sustained political commitment from all member states, the financial stability of the UN will remain under pressure. In essence, addressing the financing crisis requires both technical measures and a robust political commitment. Ensuring adequate, predictable, and sustainable funding is not only a matter of financial management, it is a reaffirmation of a shared responsibility to preserve a strong, effective multilateral system.
It has been a clear and steady trend from all those 11 years, and in fact, going further back in time, that the level of hard earmarking to specific projects has constantly increased, while the unearmarked or core funding of the UN has constantly decreased. When I started my own career as a young professional in the UN system some 25 years ago, the UN funds and agencies were funded by around 80% unearmarked or core and around 20% earmarked or non-core. Today, that has changed to the opposite of around 80% earmarked and only 20% core, or even less for some agencies. The soft earmarking, as opposed to hard earmarking, is only around 5%, and the pooled funding, where two or more UN institutions join forces for programming, only constitutes around 10% and is actually shrinking the last year. Now, why does this matter? Before I answer that, let's take one step back and remember why the United Nations was created in the first place. In the words of Dag Hammarskjöld himself, the United Nations was not created to take humanity to heaven, but to save it from hell. And in another quote, the mere fact that the governments created the UN and have maintained it is in itself evidence that mankind is capable of responding to the challenge of interdependence with which the evolution of human society has now brought us face to face as never before. End of quote. But that success of humanity also comes with a responsibility to safeguard and support the UN Charter and the principles behind United Nations and the organizations at large, and to ensure it is adequately funded to perform those functions. And not only in terms of quantity and volumes, but also in terms of the quality of the funding. The current way that the UN is funded is unsustainable in terms of quantity. The global needs, as we heard, are rising and multilateral solutions are increasingly being challenged, while at the same time, the total funding of the UN system decreased for the first time in history by almost 10% in nominal terms and by almost 13% in real terms. And this was between 2022 and 2023, the latest year we have the official statistics from. Since 2023, we've heard from most top donors to the UN system that they are or will decrease their overall ODA, in some cases quite dramatically, which will also have a dramatic effect on the UN funding. And add to that the UN's liquidity crisis this year and in many years before, but due to so many member states not paying their assessed funding in time or not paying at all. So we're looking at a very bleak outcome for UN funding in 2024, in 2025 this year and beyond. This at a time when the world is in desperate need of a stronger UN, not a weaker one. In addition to the urgent crisis regarding financial volume, there's also a crisis in the way that the UN is funded that is detrimental to its operations. And that is the constantly increasing use of earmarking funds and the underutilization of pooled funding as an instrument. This type of funding structure, it limits the UN's effectiveness, its strategic abilities, its flexibility, as we heard from the Chilean ambassador, and it undermines country ownership and scatters the UN's already dwindling resources on multiple smaller projects with a short lifespan. So given all of this, I was then positively energized and hopeful when I heard of this suggestion for universal UN member state contribution of 0.1% of gross national income. If that would become a reality, it would really go a long way in ensuring both the quantity and the quality needs of funding the UN system.
Pointing to the three principal reforms that are proposed in the chapter on the UN finance. One essentially is to move to a system in which countries' contributions to the UN budget are set at something like 0.1% of GNI. Ultimately, it is the member states themselves that will determine, at what level they set its contributions. But we chose 0.1 for a number of reasons. First of all, 0.1 of GNI in today's global economy is equivalent to about $115 billion. Right? So this would expand in a significant way the volume of resources available to the UN system. Here we're including peacekeeping operations, the broadest definition of the UN budget that we work with. Now, the criticism that $115 billion is a great deal of money, and it's certainly more than the UN system is generating today. One would have to point out that most countries today are spending somewhere between 2, 3, 4, 5% of GNI on defense, and building up our military establishment. The IMF tells us that subsidies to energy on a global scale are equivalent to 7% of GDP on a global scale, right? So that's about 70 times more than this proposed contribution to the UN system. Just to put things in perspective, right? So we think that setting this level of contribution is reasonable. It would be an obligation of membership, and it would depoliticize the system in an important way. I think one of the problems that the UN finance system has is that it is very asymmetric. There are a large number of countries whose contributions are set at 0.001% of the overall budget. And this creates a kind of a lack of ownership for the UN as an institution. When I last looked at these numbers a few months ago, I was somewhat sort of not all, because that is such statistic that I had seen before, but Switzerland, which is not a particularly large contributor among the high-income countries, its contribution is in dollar terms is larger than the contribution of the 120 countries of the UN with the smallest contribution. Right, so we have this asymmetry where a lot of the funding comes from a very small number of countries. So that's one. Second proposal is the idea that we could move the UN system to a funding system, to a system that generates resources on a more predictable fashion. And here we think that there is a great deal to learn from the model used in the European Union, where European Union countries contribute to the European Union budget in an automatic fashion. 1% of VAT taxes, 1% of customs duties, also 1% of GNI goes directly to the budget. And this creates a system in which the European Union can do budgeting over every 6 years. They don't have annual budgets. They have these long budgetary cycles because they are assured that the resources will come. If a anti-EU, or as they call a Eurosceptic prime minister is elected in one of the member countries, and he wants to cut down the contributions to the EU budget, he cannot do it because this is embedded in European Union law. So he would have to persuade other members to go along with him, and that's not that. So this is a kind of a useful model that would allow the UN, to generate resources in an automatic, depoliticized manner.
I think this question about moving from reactive crisis management to preventive global governance is coming to the fore now for a host of reasons. And I may be a little bit more politically incorrect, and my colleagues out here will tell me later if what I'm saying is too far. But with all the challenges that the UN has faced, there's always been a certain degree of follow the moneyness to it. Where is the source of the funding that is causing this difficulty? And as we look at the circumstances right now, we're seeing quite viscerally what happens when an international order is too dependent on a small number of donors. And to be more on points, that number may be one. But even ignoring the UN's financial circumstances, we see what it is when the world becomes over-reliant on, again, a small number of guarantors. So that may not be UN contributions, but guarantors of security, of development. If that number is one, then what happens when that one makes a dramatic shift in policy? And we're seeing such suffering in the world today. We would not wish this form of transition on anyone. But it can't be denied that a stronger international order would be one that can withstand the changes, temporary and sort of quixotic. I don't know what the word is, but the dramatic changes that take place in any one country. So how can we essentially free the international order from the confines of the whims of a small number of donors? How can we make it so that the whims of the powerful are not determinative of the direction of travel? If we continue to privilege the opinions and the priorities of the victors of an unjust order, what hope do we truly have for justice to prevail? We become reliant entirely on the magnanimity, the so-called enlightenment of the victors of this order. So the whole financing protocol, to me, actually has just as much to do with justice as it has to do with money. Imagine a world where there's a fixed budget for the international order, as we've been saying. So, I mean, I almost want to close our eyes and think, we have this fixed budget. It's paid as a matter of course, as Russo was just saying, by sort of a silent machine working in the background. And of course, there need to be formulas for this silent machine. I don't want to overlook that. But I actually think that simplicity in the collection for purposes of transparency would have great benefits. If we know that every country is paying 1% of GNI, or that there's this percent on the financial transaction tax, or that luxury goods are taxed this much, if it's transparent and simple, that will help in terms of our understanding. But I'm a fan also of nuance at the level of distribution. So simplify the collection and then move complex the distribution. I don't think anybody online can hear the noise of the construction happening there, but hopefully it won't distract us here. We also have to work on infrastructure. But also with this idea that everybody gives a little bit, there becomes a degree of ownership. So if everyone's paying in, some are receiving more than they pay in, but everyone has as this terrible term, has some skin in the game. So let's imagine there's this large pot of money supplied from a host of sources, member states, Tobin tax, international flights, all of these things. And in this pool is what the international institutions have to play with. And no government, no donor can give earmarks. This is what Peter was saying earlier. This is, I think, really aligned with maybe a more coherent vision of financing. And that money would then be used exclusively to carry out the mandates that the member states agreed to. This gets to what the ambassador was saying. If member states agree to more mandates, then the pot will need to grow. Right now, we have a situation where member states inflate their expectations of the UN. They inflate the number of mandates, and at the same time, they deflate the budget. So can we actually be surprised that people lose faith in the UN? They lose trust in their institutions. There's this promise that's getting bigger and bigger. The UN is going to say this and say that, do this and do that. Oh, but it's going to do all of this with less money. Of course, we can't trust it because we know then that the words that they say aren't backed by the resources necessary. Imagine what it would look like for a Secretary General to be freed from preferring certain countries, certain donors, from being overly careful with their words for fear of the implications. What an international aid agency would be able to do if it had a reliable source of funding. They knew that the next emergency shipment would be there. In fact, what one would imagine, because it's in the best interest of all, is that there would be budget crisis management. Civil society has grown so much more complex over the last 80 years. If I were to ask everybody in this room and online to define it, I suspect we would have more definitions than people. Somehow we'd matter, because that's how civil society is. We also give multiple answers at the same time. So it is a complicated subject, but one that needs to somehow be addressed. not only in terms of what civil society is, but what participation looks like. Is it just a seat on a panel, a seat in a room? What does it take for the authorities, in this case, the member states or the UN, to actually take on board recommendations from civil society? And who does civil society represent in the first place? I mean, I know that I represent I can't even pronounce my own job. I represent the Baha'i international community, which is the worldwide Baha'i community, and I actually have a bit of confidence in that. But I don't know how many members of civil society can actually say that they truly represent the populations that they claim to. And so then what responsibility do governments have to listen to that civil society, who may be a civil society of one? A very eloquent and powerful one, but it may just be one. And I'm not entirely sure. So that's on the input side of it. But we also have another structural question, which is, should civil society be participating in every space in the same way? Should it have access to some of these deeper security issues that maybe the Security Council addresses? Should it be looking at the finances and budgets? Should it be offering thoughts on how development should work? I think the answers to those three questions are very different.
Why? We already have a general assembly. Why would you want to add a parliamentary assembly? Isn't that just another redundancy that's going to make it even harder to get anything done at the United Nations? And I think the answer to that, what we all feel, is that it is a very, very different kind of animal, having a parliamentary assembly. And the way we select the parliamentarians is for countries that are willing. We suggest, like with the European Parliament, that there's direct elections, that the citizens directly elect parliamentarians. For countries that are ready to go, hopefully like the European countries that are already doing that, which start out by setting a model doing that. For countries that aren't ready to go that far, their own parliaments could appoint out of people that were already elected at the national level. So when you think about it, this is not the same thing as the General Assembly. This is a very, very different kind of structure, because instead of the delegates receiving direction in their national capitals, they're independent and they're beholden really to their constituents who work to get them elected, there's direct access to them in a way it's very hard to get access, obviously, to national governments in their capitals that are by definition centralized. Here you would have 600 to start, later on maybe 800 representatives, and they'd all, hopefully be open to the people who were electing them in the way this works in national parliaments. And so what you would have is, following up on the civil society protocol, you'd have an entity that was much more receptive to citizens. And if it could begin to work the way it does in successful parliamentary systems at the domestic level, then citizens could directly lobby the parliamentarians. And the parliamentarians could align with each other, not based on, they wouldn't have armies, they'd be unarmed, and they could align based on interest and ideology. And so they would have shifting coalitions. And the citizens, if they're involved in this decision-making and gradually the different interests that are largely in the ambit of national parliaments, begin to move into the orbit of this United Nations Parliamentary Assembly, then we suddenly have all of the different interests that are just operating at the state level beginning to operate much more coherently at the international level. And after all, they're the ones that ultimately the governments depend on for legitimacy of what they're doing. Governments are nothing without their citizens. And so if you began to create a transnational politics at the United Nations that really transcended states, we could see a very, very different kind of political structure building. And I would suggest that this is a political structure which could begin to give people around the world confidence that we can do things differently, that we don't have to be stuck in the same old paradigm of nations threatening each other and potentially going to war with each other, but that there's a different kind of politics. And I just want to say, I wanted to conclude because there's people that want to speak, but I just want to say, I think this is so important, not only in having a new model that could evolve slowly, and it's already really proved itself successful in Europe. So there's some evidence that this can actually work at transnational level, and it's being tried in a lot of other places. Many of you will know the African Union has a parliament. Many other international bodies have parliaments as well. But I think beyond just the ability for it to create a much more functional system, I think, and this ties into the civil society protocol as well, it's so important to bring this initiative out of this room and to the people of the world.
My name is Bani Dugar, and I represent the Baha'i international community to the UN. And delighted to join you at this session after a really dynamic one this morning. We're moving from the critical topic of financing the UN to a roadmap of collective security and disarmament. And history has shown that bold institutional change is possible. The formation of the UN was one such time, and the UN Charter itself. And it was a time of great hope, which emerged from the embers of the Second World War. And I hope we are not going to have to wait for something quite as stark as another world war before the international community is ready to make some bold changes. And it's this tremendous initiative, Rusto and his Global Governance Forum, that has brought us here. And we are actually in a position to be discussing some of the possible ways forward. The 1945 Charter envisioned a system in which Security Council would formulate plans to regulate armaments and conclude agreements to make forces, assistance, and facilities available for maintaining peace. But those provisions were never implemented. And yet, today's risks are making those really, really very urgent. We need to realize these as soon as possible. So this session is presenting this proposed roadmap as a bridge from paralysis to capability.
We do have a global target, a global aspiration, which is stated as the world free of nuclear weapons. But many in the nuclear world, we are seeing that we are moving away from the ambition and currently reflecting not only the dynamics of the arms race, but also plunging us back into the security dilemma of the previous period before the Second War. And the second concern is that then we are not seeing an impasse in terms of the conversation, but that we are seeing is that we are losing these diplomatic and legal guide rails that we have been built for the last generations to stop both vertical and horizontal proliferation. The second aspect that is of concern, and this I will sum all of this up in some thoughts or reflections regarding how to break this situation. But the second concern is that this dynamic is not only visible in government policy, but it is also reflecting in shifting public opinion in many areas and regions where security dilemmas have become more acute. Obviously, the invasion of Ukraine has marked a true inflection point in this regard, not only because it catalyzed moves towards a militarized or a revalorization of the military might,
and of nuclear deterrence as a valid security response, and moves such as several nations becoming part of NATO, but also because we can see not only in Europe but also in Asia this historic turnaround in public opinion and attitudes. For the first time, for instance, for the first time since the Cold War, a majority of Germans see nuclear weapons as potentially providing a positive deterrent. We must challenge the belief that militarization equals security. And we did that even during the Cold War with the detente. And in the 1970s, you referred to the Helsinki process. I would also refer to the Stockholm Conference of 1972 and that environment track, which was very much that alternative of talking to each other, even though the Soviet Union was not at the Stockholm Conference. And the entire Eastern Bloc boycotted the Stockholm Conference because East Germany was not allowed to participate. It was not considered a state at the time. And yet, Morris Strong, to actually go back to the leadership issues that Elaine raised, but also we discussed in earlier panel, Morris Strong, as the executive secretary of the Stockholm Conference, he made sure that he is on the phone with the Soviet Union every day, and that they knew what was happening. I mean, China was at the conference, but that was also a relationship that was being built by the individuals in leadership and ensuring that, okay, you are in this seat. What are your positions? How are you understanding? And so those formal and informal channels of diplomacy are absolutely critical. And indeed, it is realpolitik, and it isn't, right? It's you have certain interests, but then how do you build dialogue? And so, to answer your question, Bani, I think we need 3 shifts to move from militarization to different type of security.
We're headed in the opposite direction. And I think Sudan, Ukraine, Gaza, even the U.S. actions at the Caribbean Sea suggest that we're heading in a direction where total war is becoming acceptable, and attacks on civilians under some sort of principle of this military necessity is becoming acceptable. And that is one where enemy civilians are at risk of being sacrificed in great numbers, just to the over, well, we need to do this, but let's remember this. In that 3 tracks, I think this is where some realistic thinking is necessary to change the incentive structures that was mentioned, because I think that if we do recognize that this is where we are headed, that there is a slippage towards going back to a pre-UN period in which total war was acceptable and was part of military strategies, then none of us are safe. None of us are safe, especially in an era of hypersonic missiles and drone warfare that is increasingly easy to get your hands on with very limited means. And so we can convince on the principle of interest that perhaps we can connect it to disarmament and start the conversation about thresholds, verification mechanisms. And this is where I think the sort of 3-track part is useful. But we can think in terms of realism, connected up to the concept of thinking, and use small state diplomacy to start setting up those processes. And incidentally, I think there is precedent for this that is worth marking. Just this month, we're celebrating the 40th anniversary of the Geneva Summit between Reagan and Gorbachev, where it was first sort of recognized that a nuclear war can never be won, it should never be fought. And I think we could do well to sort of rekindle that spirit of the Geneva Summit and the Reykjavik Summit the following year, where by most historians' accounts, we actually came closest to actually true disarmament.
The Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons not only is an instrument to advance comprehensive disarmament, but also I think it really triggered a new era in the global conversation about nuclear weapons. It elevated the scientific input, scientific community, and the scientific and policy interface, together with the humanitarian and obviously the survivor perspective, to the center of the global discussion. I think the entry into force of the treaty, despite the fact that there were specific efforts to avoid this instrument to enter into force, it really showed the commitment of the nations that supported this instrument. And it did create a very important momentum. And I like the word the word momentum. It is fundamental in politics in general, but in multilateralism, I think it is a critical word. How do we translate that momentum in a moment in which we lost momentum, not in terms of the ratification process, but in terms of the understanding of the public? And the reason why I mentioned as a great concern the trends that we are seeing both in Europe and in some parts of Asia, of a new acceptance from the public of nuclear security. That is something that should be of our concern. But on the other hand, the TPNW also has brought momentum to three critical discussions and dimensions of the global debate. The first one is finally the possibility to address the legacy of nuclear weapons use and nuclear testing on affected populations. Now, this is not only a part of the formal agenda of the United Nations, both at the General Assembly and the Human Rights Council, as well as in the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, where this is going to be one of the aspects of the review conference that is going to take place next year or in 27.
We as human beings need to put out there, as they have the 10 Commandments, you need so that all of us can join together, the alliance of all these organizations, the civic, the universities, the colleges, the 501c3s. We have got to establish a global ethic and write down what is that? What is the entrainment in the brain so that we can become an irresistible force of determination for peace. And I think that's what we have to do. All these great ideas, if we take all of that and put them together and then try to get a kernel that will innovate and accelerate this idea of universal peace, where all these other conversations fall under. It is absolutely integral to us to establish this alliance and get a global ethic so that we can put it out there and have people have the idea, the entrainment in their brain that we have got to survive on this planet and do what we have to do. And God bless you, Dr. Augusto. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, friends. Thank you, speakers. It was just an amazing opportunity and lunch with themselves. So thank you, everyone online.